I'd like to share with you some of the things that have piqued my interest and caused me to want to learn more and be a better doctor. A few of the subjects that I've addressed in the newsletters. The first one is the popular thought that sugar feeds cancer. It's one of those things, everybody knows it to be so. Sugar feeds cancer. The people who promote that are, I'll call them, they're my enemies. They're your enemies too. These are people who are into the low-carb movement. Low carb means you don't eat rice, corn, potatoes, sweet potatoes, beans, peas, and lentils. Instead, you eat cows, pigs, chickens, fishes, and the secretions of those animals, mammalian secretions of those animals. That's what they recommend. Atkins, Wheat Belly, Grain Brain. I mean, I could go on. But they're the low-carb movement, so they tell you it's carbohydrate, it's sugar. Oh, when I say sugar, I generally mean rice, corn, potatoes, beans, peas, and lentils. When they say sugar, they initially tell you white sugar, but then they go on and say, no, we also mean rice, corn, beans, potatoes, sweet potatoes, etc. So if they just stopped at sugar, like table sugar, I could live with it. But they don't. They go on and demonize the foods that you need to eat. Now, just to be clear, and I am becoming popular enough that I am attracting a few detractors who will try and confuse you. But just to be clear, I know that table sugar is not good for you, but tastes good. It rots your teeth. It's incomplete calories, in fact, empty calories. It'll raise your triglycerides. So it's not health food, but it does add to the flavor. And so what we do as a general recommendation is we recommend you eat oatmeal. By the way, this was a problem the morning before last because Mary and I have oatmeal and blueberries every morning for breakfast. And my oatmeal gets sprinkled, if at all, with just a tiny bit of sugar. But the bowl I got 2 days ago was probably a whole teaspoon of sugar. She mixed them up. Mary did. So we use a little simple sugar in the food. We use a little salt on the surface of the food. But we do not recommend a bowl of Fruit Loops and a half a bottle of sugar. So let's get that right. So the low carbers, what they say is that sugar feeds cancer. And we all know sugar rots teeth. And sugar is a bad guy, and we're glad it's been outed, sugar. But the low carbers are missing the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is the animal foods and vegetable oils. Now, why do they miss the elephant in the room? Well, I know part of it is because that's the way they eat, and it shows. Take a look at many of these low carbers. We won't go into that. But they look like they eat all those animals and oils. That's part of the reason, plus industry. Industry, as I see it, and I know this is what happened, is it got to a point in the 70s and 80s where the public knew it was the food. So they had to make a sacrificial lamb. Rather than destroying the poultry, the pig, the cow industries, they decided to sacrifice the sugar industry. And it's worked well. It's kept people's focus of attention off the real problem, which is the animal foods and oils. So these people who are on the low-carb message, they're going to tell you the most frightening thing in the world, don't eat sugar. It's going to cause, sure they say cause, but more frightening, it's going to promote the growth of cancer. Now, I've been at this a long time. Next year, I'll have been in medicine for a half a century. Yeah. I've been doing what I do now for 40 years. So I've seen a lot. I've seen things come and go, but there are things that are the truth that have come, and the only reason they're gone is because the money doesn't keep your focus of attention on these things. One of the major things that was published was in 1982, a thorough scientific review by the best of our researchers. It is called, you can still get it, it's called Diet, Nutrition, and Cancer. And it was put out by the National Research Council. And this is what they said in this huge document. They said, and you can read it, the evidence from both epidemiologic, which are population studies, and laboratory studies is too sparse to suggest a direct role of carbohydrate, possibly exclusive of dietary fiber. Fiber is not a digestible carbohydrate. It's just chains of starch, but the linkages between the glucoses are non-digestible. So these chains of sugar, they persist through the digestive tract. That's fiber. The ones that are digestible, the chains of sugar, called starch, amylose and amylopectin, they are what we think of as digestible carbohydrate. So anyway, the nutrition panel said, save for some dietary fiber, which is only present in plants, there's just too little evidence to condemn carbohydrates. Then they go on and say the committee concluded that of all the dietary components studied, the combined epidemiologic, in other words, population studies, and experimental evidence is most suggestive for a causal relationship between fat intake and the occurrence of cancer. That truth has not changed. If you would like to look at the evidence and you start to try and support low carbohydrate diets, and you may be in that direction because you were raised on bacon, eggs, and cheese, if you want to buy into the low carbohydrates theme, the first thing you have to do is you have to look at the overall impact of low carbohydrate diets on people's health. Before we even get to the cancer, if I become Surgeon General, let's see, has he been picked yet or she been picked yet? No, I guess not yet. But it could happen in a couple of days. If I were appointed Surgeon General, then I would require all low carbers, before they gave a speech on cancer, heart disease, weight loss, etc., to show a disclaimer. They must, by law, under my rule, they must, by law, put a disclaimer out that says there are 4 major studies, only 4, major studies on the effect of low carbohydrate diets on the risk of dying and dying of heart disease and having a heart attack or a second heart attack. There are only 4. And if you want to look them up and you want to see the original studies, you go to my March 2016 newsletter, and all 4 of these major studies, there is no other one, all 4 major studies say that these diets increase your risk of heart attacks, premature death, and sickness. So anybody that gives a speech any place worldwide, and if you are listening to low carbers, that's what I'm going to do. You're going to be required to put a disclaimer in front of your talk before you go on and say anything about weight loss, etc. All right, sugar causes cancer. There are three levels of faulty thinking that cause people to do this. And if you start to read about sugar causing cancer, they will address all of these things for you, but incorrectly. They are not telling the truth, not just exaggerating, but I'd have to use a stronger word than that. First of all, epidemiologic studies, in other words, population studies, show populations that eat a lot of sugar have a lot of cancers. Here, for example, colon cancer. You see the worldwide population, you see countries like the United States and Canada and Brazil and Australia and New Zealand and Western Europe. They have high rates of colon cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer. They also eat a lot of sugar. But as I mentioned, that's the scapegoat. It's not healthy. But what do these countries also eat a lot of? In the last 35 years in Asia and Central America, they have doubled their intake of animal foods, that means dairy and meats, and doubled their intake of vegetable oils. So it's misinterpretation of the epidemiologic data. In other words, saying, yes, they eat a lot of sugar, but not noticing that they also eat a lot of pigs and cows and chickens and corn oil, etc. Industry had to do that. They had to have some sacrificial lamb. Otherwise, lamb, wasn't it? That's probably a poor choice. All right, so anyway, they distort the true epidemiology of what's going on. The dietary mechanisms that cause cancer, if you look at the different mechanisms and you do the scientific research, and by the way, you can have all these papers for free. You just go to my February 2015 newsletter, you just click on the links. You don't even have to look them up. But what you'll find is that all the factors we're talking about are tied to animal foods most directly. Like, for example, obesity. Obesity promotes cancer. Well, the strongest promoter of obesity is the fat you eat is the fat you wear. In other words, it's fat in the form of animals or free vegetable oils. The studies show that you discourage cancer growth when you cut out meat, when you cut out dairy, when you cut out things that promote growth factors, which are meat and dairy and other proteins. When you give up vegetable oils, then cancer incidence and the growth of cancer is slowed. There are cancer-promoting chemicals in these foods because they're high on the food chain. You know, you remember that story about bioaccumulation. You start with the crops or the seaweed or whatever that has low levels of these carcinogens present on the plant foods. The fish eats the seaweed or algae, or the cow eats the grass. These chemicals are fat attracted, fat soluble. They get sucked up by the fat. And so when you eat high on the food chain, you promote cancer. If you want to slow cancer, you eat low on the food chain. The immune system is enhanced in its cancer-fighting abilities by consuming plant nutrients. You grow the right kind of intestinal bacteria when you eat this kind of diet. There was just a meeting, big national meeting, about the microflora, the organism living in your bowel. And the key speaker was asked, when different diets were discussed, as to which diet grows the most optimal flora. The McDougall diet was the response. There are all kinds of ingredients in plants that slow the growth of cancer and prevent cancer. If you want to look up the papers, you'll find them in my February 2015 newsletter. But as the report in 1982 said, the evidence incriminating sugar is sparse at best, and incriminating fat in animal foods is huge. So they misinterpret epidemiologic studies. The second point that confuses people in the argument they use as to why sugar promotes cancer is based upon calorie restriction research. If you restrict food intake, calorie intake, then you will live longer and you'll have less risk of cancer and the cancer will grow more slowly. This is documented scientific fact. Hundreds of studies have been done on animals and people. We've had actually guest speakers here who've discussed their research in terms of calorie restriction and longevity and preventing disease. An interesting study published in the Public Library of Science Biology Journal, when they looked at calorie restriction in fruit flies. This has been extended to other animal studies, but fruit flies doesn't get anybody upset. You don't want me to get into any disagreement with those of you who, as I do, strongly believe in animal rights. But fruit flies are okay, I think, to talk about. When they studied fruit flies, they found it wasn't calorie restriction that was the main issue. It was restricting fats and proteins. You know. And being hungry sounds terrible, doesn't it? And how many people could do this? Fontana is the doctor's name who has been here, who has talked on this stage about calorie restriction. You remember him, some of you have met Dr. Fontana. And he asks his people, his patients, to go hungry. That's one way of approaching it, but I have another, I think, better way to do it, done by Lauren Listner, a research study that he and his group did back in 1987. They published it. They took people and they put them in a live-in situation where they had full control of their food. Complete control of their food. And they made the food, and they would make biscuits and breads and soups and stews that all looked the same and tasted the same, However, what they did as an experiment is they changed the amount of fat in the various foods. And they told people to eat as much as you want. Completely unrestricted, no portion control at all. And this is what they found. Is that which is the top line, when the diet was 40 to 50% fat, the average calorie intake was 2,600 calories a day. Unbeknownst to the participants, they dropped the fat intake from 45 to 50% down to 30 to 35%. And their calorie intake dropped about 400 calories, spontaneously without thought. And then they dropped their fat intake down to 15 to 20%. By the way, what you're eating here is 7% fat. And what they did is they spontaneously dropped their calorie intake by 600 to 800 calories a day. Now that's calorie restriction I can live with, rather than being hungry. Another presenter that we've had here at this Advanced Study Weekend is Dan Buettner. Do you remember him? Phenomenal. The Blue Zones, he's made a huge change in the world by his writings, which began, I believe, in 2006 in National Geographic. What they did is they looked at populations in the world where people lived the longest and healthiest. The most centenarians, people who live past 100, in various populations of the world. And he identified different populations and talked to them about them, like people in Loma Linda, California, and Nicoya, Costa Rica, and Sardinia, Italy, and that's a tough one. Ikaria, Greece, probably not right, but close enough, and Okinawa, Japan. Now what he discovered, and actually it was interesting to have Dan Buettner here on 2 occasions. We had some interesting conversations. One of the things I asked Dan on our first discussion, he talked about how they were plant-based, they ate lots of vegetables and so on. I said, but did you consider the fact that all of these people ate starch-based diets? That was an aha moment for Mr. Buettner, and everything made sense, a lot more sense, I think, to him. When you focus your thinking, instead of eating lots of broccoli and cauliflower, you're eating lots of sweet potatoes and rice and so on. These people have much less cancer, they eat more carbohydrate, more sugar. Each one of these populations eats more sugar. The studies done on the Loma Linda population showed back in the 1980s they had 1/4 of breast cancer. People living in California, women living in California, because of their Loma Linda Seventh-day Adventist diet. They eat lots of sugar, they have less cancer. And wherever you look in the world at this relationship between sugar intake, corn, bean, rice, potatoes, sweet potatoes, etc., and breast, colon, and prostate cancer, etc., you find the same relationship. So how does sugar feed cancer? All right, the third problem with this one's a little more complex, and if some of you tune me out, that's fine. But the third argument they use is based on research done by Otto Warburg, which was published in Science in 1956, but which was done back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Dr. Warburg, a German scientist, he discovered the origin of cancer. And by the way, if you look at cancer researchers today, the vast majority believe Otto Warburg was correct. This is not a minority opinion. The origin of cancer. Now, what Dr. Warburg discovered through his various research, and you can go into detail on this, is he discovered that normal cells, non-cancerous cells, have an ability to gain energy by using aerobic metabolism. In other words, a normal healthy cell, it can use oxygen to produce a lot of energy, called ATP. What happens to change a normal cell into a cancer cell is the respiratory mechanism of the cell, which is in the mitochondria, is damaged. Otto Warburg's theories are accepted by the vast majority of scientists. So cells can no longer use oxygen to make lots of energy. Instead, they do something called fermentation or anaerobic glycolysis, which is very inefficient, and they do it only because their respiratory mechanisms have been damaged. How have they been damaged? Well, environmental chemicals, that would fit. Yeah, that's one possibility, sure, environmental chemicals. But this is, there's another whole part of this theory, not theory, but truth in laboratory experimentations, is that Dr. Warburg could take in the Petri dish with a bell jar, which could change the oxygen presence or concentration for these cells. He could turn normal cells into cancer cells just by depriving them of oxygen. Yeah. So that's a way of damaging the respiratory system, and the efficiency of cell respiration is to deprive the cells of oxygen. Well, here is the way that people chronically deprive their cells of oxygen. It's by what they eat. When you eat high-fat foods, if you look at the first frame here, what you're looking at is a blood vessel that has individual red blood cells flowing, bouncing off each other, not sticking together. And then you feed one high-fat meal. And what happens is these cells, which have a natural tendency to repel each other, they get coated with fat. And so instead of bouncing off each other with free circulation, they start to clump together. It happens within minutes. And they continue to clump together and sludge, and the sludging continues for 6, 8, 10 hours until the circulation is severely impaired. If you are a nurse or doctor, you know about an oxygen measurement that we do every minute in the hospital, where we do an arterial stick and we look at the oxygen content of the blood. And what is found is after a single high-fat meal, the oxygen content of the blood is dropped about 20%. Remember Otto Warburg said that the difference between normal cells and cancer cells is the kind of respiration they do, and the way to deprive a cell of oxygen is to just eat the typical American diet. And so here you have chronic, peripheral, cellular, relative hypoxia occurring throughout the body. Let me show you a video done by one of my mentors. This is the circulation prior to any meal. And you see the cells, they hit, they bounce off each other. Everything is as it should be. The oxygen content is 100%. These are animal studies, but I'll show you the human in just a minute. So you feed the fat. The fat coats the cells. They hit, they stick together, they clump. The oxygen content, PO2, drops 20% in human beings. And the sludging continues and continues and continues. The typical American eats one high-fat meal after another, so this happens 2, 3, 6, 14 times a day. And by the way, I want you to listen carefully, is vegetable fat causes more severe sludging that's more prolonged than animal fat does. We're talking about corn oil, flaxseed oil, olive oil, causes more severe and prolonged sludging than does animal fat, lard, etc. So the circulation finally returns if you don't do that again. This is work done by a friend of mine, Mike Friedman. He's died, but he used to be a friend of mine. And what they did is he and other researchers, Peter Coe was another researcher, and a guy named Williams. It's been published over and over again. In this particular study, what they did is they took a 44-year-old fireman. They took a picture of the white of his eye. You can see that with the microscope. And you see on your left-hand side the picture prior to any meal. This is the conjunctiva, or the white of the eye. Lots of circulation, lots of blood vessels. Then they fed this fireman one meal, and they did this on multiple people. This is just one example. One meal that contains 67% of the calories is fat. Let me describe the meal to you. 2 eggs, 4 strips of bacon, milk, cream, bread, and 2 pats of butter. Have any others of you ever had that besides me? Well, you see the change in the circulation in his eye 4 hours later, which is the frame on the right-hand side. A dramatic reduction in the number and the size of the blood vessels. And if you measure the PO2, the oxygen tension in the blood, it drops 20%. So you create chronic hypoxia, low oxygen tension at the cellular level, which fits into Otto Warburg's whole discussion, which the low carbers misinterpret to prove that feeding sugar makes cancer cells grow faster. Not true. Damage in the respiratory system, creating hypoxia, does make cancer grow more aggressively. And that's what the science says. Finally, the American Cancer Society recognized February 13th of 2015 in its official publication. It recognized and told doctors, oncologists, general practitioners, family practitioners, told doctors and dietitians that when patients get cancer, if you switch them to a more prudent plant-based diet, they will live longer. How many physicians do you think include this as part of their patient visit when somebody comes in with breast, colon, or prostate cancer? Not many. No. But anyway, that's what the truth is. I published the first study on the dietary treatment of cancer in 1984. And if you go to the February 2015 newsletter, you'll find dozens of studies. This is not a cherry-picking bias selection of the literature. It's what the literature says is that if you eat well and you have colon cancer, or you have breast cancer, or prostate cancer, or melanoma, if you change your diet, you will live longer.